I just want to point out tonight I'm speaking from a slightly different angle. I was very fortunate to be able to have a vacation this week with my whole family, and it was really a great time that we had. And then I did something which I never should have done, which is to try to race my 8-year-old grandsons. And as soon as I sprinted 20 meters, I immediately pulled a number of muscles. So I right now am incapable of sitting down. So I have to be standing up and giving the shear. But it's a good change of perspective. And as my sister-in-law said to me, maybe you should take another look at your birth certificate just to, keep in track, how old you really are and how old you should be acting. Before we begin today's shir, I would like to take 2 minutes to speak about a very important concept in Judaism, which is known as hakarat hatov, acknowledgement of the good. A number of months ago, when the decision was made that I would be going into retirement, Pardes said to me that they would like to find a way of somehow honoring me in the new building and being able to name a space as a way of acknowledging my dedication to Pardes for the past 43 years. And I think that Pardes has, over the years, certainly in my case, done a tremendous amount, which today I would like to express how grateful I am. When I was told about dedicating a space in my honor, I was extremely flattered and at the same time embarrassed, and I would say even felt a little bit awkward. And I didn't know how comfortable I would feel about it. And then when my beloved Malka passed away, and we began receiving emails from many, many Pardes alumni expressing what an impact our home made on them, what an impact Malka had on them. And then Pardes, after the Shiva, said to me, well, we think we'd like to name the space in honor of the two of you, and to see this as a kind of tribute to Malka's memory. There are not enough words to express how moved I am by this gesture. All the discomfort I felt has now gone to the side because I see the campaign which Pardes has now undertaken as a way of not only commemorating my beloved Malka's memory, but as a way of somehow being a tribute to the home which we established, which she was the major part responsible for, and how the honor which Pardes wants to show me is not just about me, but even more so about us as a couple, and how much whatever impact I had in the teaching in the classroom, that was not only complemented, but enhanced by the impact that our home had on many, many people's lives. So I would like to express to Pardes, not only to the institution, but to the senior staff, to the alumni, to everyone who has gone out of their way to be a part of this campaign, to all those who have contributed, to all those who may contribute. How deeply moved and grateful I am for all that you have done. As I said, words cannot adequately express how much this means to me on a very deep personal level. So thank you. What I would like to do in today's shiur is to pick up where we left last week. And I just would like to somehow summarize the major points and maybe look at them even in more detail. Because essentially what I would like to discuss is Joseph and Judah as two leadership models. And last week we began discussing Joseph. And we saw how from the very outset, Joseph displayed various leadership qualities when he's tending to the sheep, or actually tending to his brothers via the sheep. When his father gives him this special coat, which is a symbol of the leadership role that he plays. When he has the dreams, which clearly indicate how he will be the leader of the family. But now what I'd like to mention is the ups and downs of Joseph. Yes, Joseph displays all these leadership qualities, but in the aftermath of his dreams, his brothers go away. Joseph is sent to somehow bring about a reconciliation with his brothers. The brothers strip him of his coat. He's thrown into a pit. He's sold into slavery, which means that Joseph goes from being this leader, not only in potential, but in practice, to becoming a slave. And yet, when we look at chapter 39, when Joseph is in Potiphar's house, and maybe just to refresh your memory for those who want to see this again, in chapter 39, verse 2, it says how God is with Joseph, and Joseph is successful. And then if I skip to verse 4, Joseph finds favor in the eyes of his master. He serves him. And the continuation of the verse is, and his master places him in charge of everything in the household. So that we see how Joseph begins to have the switch from being somebody who was sold as a slave to being somebody who becomes a servant, but even more than that, a ruler. A ruler who is still subservient to the master of the house, but nevertheless is in charge of everything that goes on in that household. And then all of a sudden, it falls apart. Because Mrs. Potiphar is very interested in Joseph. And Joseph is not prepared to comply. And if we fast forward for a moment, essentially Mrs. Potiphar accuses Joseph of making all kinds of advances to her. Joseph is put into jail, which is again another form of confinement, but slavery, one could even say. And yet once again, in chapter 39, at the very end, we find that in chapter 39, verse 21 and then 22, that God is with Joseph, and Joseph finds favor in the eyes of the one in charge of the prison. And once again, Joseph is given a leadership role in charge of all the prisoners. And now what I'd like to do, and essentially that's what we discussed last time, although what I'd like to do is to now examine this a little bit more closely and to note the fact that Joseph's rise to leadership, as I said a moment ago, has its ups and downs. And in fact, one of the things which seems to always happen is that when Joseph is about to actualize maybe his dreams, it all falls apart. And perhaps the reason why it falls apart is because maybe there's a problem in Joseph's understanding of leadership, or maybe I should say it has not been fully cultivated, or not fully cultivated into what it should really be. And what do I mean by that? And this is going to become a very important issue, and certainly a very big issue today. How much is leadership associated with power? One might say self-aggrandizement. Or how much is leadership associated with a sense of a mission, a sense of service? And what I would like to say is that, at least at the beginning, in Joseph's case, there may be the sense of leadership, which may also have an element of power attached to it, which may have a certain, what we would call, narcissistic element. The very fact that Joseph not only has dreams, but goes out of his way to tell his brothers about the dreams. Well, what does he hope to accomplish by telling the brothers? Are they going to say, oh, that's so wonderful, we're so excited, here we are, we now will bow down to you? It's clearly a way of somehow asserting himself over the brothers. And clearly what that results in is jealousy, enmity, to the point where when we continue reading in chapter 37, we see how that when Joseph comes out to look for his brothers and the brothers see him, at least some of the brothers immediately want to kill him and then compromise by throwing him into a pit, stripping him of his coat. And the stripping him of his coat is very symbolic. It's a way of saying, you are not our leader. And you, the dreams which you have, we are now going to destroy. And as I mentioned a moment ago, once again, Joseph starts his career in the house of Potiphar in chapter 39. And I want to look at just one verse. In chapter 39, in chapter 39, verse 6, where it seems to be, as I said, that Joseph has now been put in charge of everything in the whole household, with one exception. And then at the end of the verse, it says, Vayihi Yosef Yefei Toar Vifei Mar'eh. Oh, wait a second. Excuse me. If I said this is chapter 39, okay, I may have not quote. Chapter 39, verse 6. Okay, and it says at the end of the verse, after it tells us how Joseph has reached what you might call his success in the house of Potiphar, and Joseph is beautiful, attractive. Now, the people would normally say, well, why are we being told this? Because this becomes a segue to the very next section where Mrs. Potiphar then starts looking at Joseph and becomes very interested and propositions him. There's just one little problem, which is, then why didn't verse 7 begin with saying, and Joseph was very attractive, and then Mrs. Potiphar looks at him? Why is it at the end of the previous verse rather than the beginning of the next verse? And on that basis, Rashi makes a comment, which is that once Joseph saw himself as being a ruler, he began getting very carried away with what we would call the good life. He began eating and drinking and really taking care of his good looks. At which point God said, your father is in a state of mourning, and you're just like, looking in the mirror all the time to make sure your hairdo is nice. Okay, so I'll bring the bear to now attack you. Which means that the rabbinic understanding is that Joseph's response to his leadership role was to actually get very carried away with it, to really get into the quote unquote benefits of leadership, to be able to then enjoy those benefits, and maybe to lose a sense of what the point of this is all about. And certainly according to the rabbinic understanding, Joseph, in a certain sense, brings upon himself what then happens in the ensuing incident with Mrs. Potiphar, which eventually results in his being imprisoned. And I want to say this very clearly now, that the rabbinic understanding is that each time, excuse me, I'm just, when I move around, I like stretch my muscles and then I have a hard time talking. Each time Joseph becomes too carried away and somehow becomes misguided in what the point of his leadership is all about, he needs to be rerouted. And in fact, it's not just rerouted, but he needs to be profoundly humbled, because that seems to be the problem, that leadership should not be about, as I said, self-aggrandizement. And that's what Joseph needs to learn. And now let's look a little bit more at the story at the end of last week's Parashat when Joseph is in jail. As I mentioned, Joseph was put in charge of all the prisoners, and everyone knows the story about the butler and the baker who have dreams and then tell Joseph about the dreams. And I want to look at, I want to look at one verse in chapter 40, verse 8. When they tell Joseph that they had a dream and they don't have a solution, Joseph says to them in the verse, Halo lelohim pitronim, sapru nali. Doesn't God have solutions? Tell me. Now, on the one hand, this is the first time that Joseph is actually associating God with dreams. Okay, I mentioned it, I think, last week, but in the initial dreams which Joseph has, there is no mention of God in the dream. And that in itself raises a question. Is this actually some form of prophetic revelation? Or is this simply Joseph's delusions of grandeur? Over here is the first time where Joseph connects God with dreams, but he connects God as being the one who can solve dreams, not as the one who is the source of the dreams. But also note the way Joseph phrases it. Doesn't God have solutions? Tell me. Well, at face value, that sounds either like, tell me because I'm God, or tell me because I have somehow this access or into God, which sounds a little bit pompous, but okay. And as everybody knows, they tell Joseph the dreams, Joseph solves the dreams. And then what I want to look at is, again, another verse. In verse 14, after Joseph solves the dream of the butler, look at verse 14. Joseph says, Ki im zachartani itcha, remember me with you. Kasher yitav lach, when it will be good to you. Ve'asita na imadi chesed, and do kindness with me. Ve'hizkartani el paro, v'hotzeitani min habayit hazeh, and then mention me to Pharaoh. Get me out of this place. Ki gunov gunavti, I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews. V'gam po lo asiti me'uma, and here I didn't do anything. Ki samu oti babor, because they put me in this pit. By the way, I'd just like to say the fact that Joseph refers to this as the pit may mean that this brings up recollections of what happened with his brothers when he was thrown into the pit. Now, somebody could come along and say that, Joseph was being really smart over here because Joseph now sees an opportunity, and why not make the most of it? Because he really believes that in the end, the butler, right, will be reinstated in his position. And here's an opportunity to put in a good word with Pharaoh to finally get him out and to have justice done. If we fast forward to verse 23, when in fact, and this is the last verse of the Parsha, when in fact the butler is reinstated, it says, V'lo zachar sar hamashkim et Yosef vayishkachehu. And the butler didn't remember Joseph. He forgot him. And the rabbis, which I think is certainly the pshat, the simple meaning here, say, well, he didn't remember Joseph initially on the day he was reinstated. And one might very well say, well, he didn't remember him because he's so excited about his own personal success, right? In other words, so Joseph is kind of in the background. But then he forgot him subsequently. And what I would like to add is that it's not just that he forgot him, but maybe he consciously forgot him. With the idea being, the butler, what vested interest does he have in putting in a good word with Pharaoh, or attempting to put in a good word with Pharaoh, which potentially might jeopardize, right, his reinstatement? And therefore, in retrospect, maybe it wasn't such a smart idea for Joseph to say this to the butler. And I'll just say that the rabbis actually castigate Joseph. And they make the point of saying, because Joseph put his hope and his trust in the butler, he remained in jail for another 2 years. And in fact, what the rabbis say, and this is quoted by Rashi, that Joseph should have put his trust in God and not in Egyptians who you can't put your trust in. And in fact, I think, perhaps what the rabbis maybe wanted to say with this is that, at least without getting into, being politically correct or anything else and making slurs about anyone, but at least in this particular society, We're not necessarily dealing with a society where people are altruistic. And especially for people who are working, right, in the king's court, as we know, there's a lot of politicking. And that very often people are looking out for their own interests. So the idea that someone would now be looking out for Joseph's interests, how could he have thought that? I want to maybe add something, and I'm sure there'll be people who will disagree with me, but I'd like to be a little bit provocative, that it might also be that, there's always a fine line between grabbing an opportunity and maybe being opportunistic to the point where maybe you are groveling. And maybe that's so that it's not so much like, oh, an opportunity presented itself, and you shouldn't have taken that opportunity because you should just have faith in God. It's that it's not just, the having faith in God, but it's also how you take advantage of the opportunity. And maybe there was something very problematic of Joseph in how he presented himself, which meant he was still not ripe for going out of jail and finally becoming a leader, and still needed to perhaps spend another 2 years in training. So what I would like to do now, I can't straighten up, I have to keep on leaning, otherwise I'll lose my voice. What I'd like to do now is actually look at the beginning of our Parashat. And again, I'm focusing it through the lenses of Joseph and leadership. And if you look at the very opening verse, so as you can see, right in the beginning of our Parashat Miketz, that 2 years elapsed. And then Pharaoh has a dream. So that this is where the rabbis came from about Joseph having to spend another 2 years in jail. And we're not going to go through Pharaoh's dreams. Right now, that doesn't interest me. But what does interest me is Pharaoh is unable to find anyone to solve his dreams. And now let's look at verse 9. All of a sudden, we hear the butler speaking. The butler who didn't remember Joseph, who forgot Joseph. And then he all of a sudden pipes up and says to Pharaoh, I mentioned my sins today. And then he goes into this whole thing about how Pharaoh had been angry with him, put him in jail, and he describes to him how he and the baker had dreams. And now what's interesting to me is verse 12, how he describes Joseph. V'shamitanu na'ar ivri, a Hebrew boy, Eved, a slave, l'sara tabachim. And then he's to the executioner. And then he says, and we told him, and he solved our dreams, each one. And it turned out exactly the way it was supposed to be. But what matters to me is how he describes Joseph. He does not exactly describe Joseph in very rosy terms, in very complimentary terms. Who is this Joseph? He's a Hebrew boy, a slave boy. Now, right, and this is my reading of the text. Why all of a sudden is he speaking? Because he actually thinks that Joseph could be critical over here in solving Pharaoh's dreams. And if Joseph actually does solve Pharaoh's dreams, who's going to get the credit for it? Well, not Joseph. He'll get the credit because he's the one who brought him out. And not only that, but why would Pharaoh want to honor Joseph? After all, who is Joseph? He's a slave. He's a Hebrew. He's the other. He's a lad. He's not anybody, as opposed to this individual who is the prince, right? I don't know. We probably find today some very, fancy title, right? I think that's the big thing today. And it doesn't matter what your position is, right? Everybody, but you always get a fancy title. Personally, I have a problem with all that, but okay. But in any case, so he'll get all the accolades for this. Now, what I want to make, the point which I want to make is, but maybe Joseph is a little bit responsible for that as well. Because when Joseph said to him, mention me to Pharaoh, Joseph presents himself as this, right? For those of you who know a little bit Yiddish, Nebuch, this unfortunate person. I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews, right? And here I didn't do anything. And maybe this is why I said that maybe Joseph, it's not just grabbing an opportunity, but how do you present yourself? And the image which I have is that he was groveling, he was begging the butler and begging for amnesty. And the butler, because Joseph does not present himself in a quote unquote very dignified way, that's exactly the way he presents him to Pharaoh. And now let's look at what happens subsequently. Verse 14. Vayishlach Paro vayikra et Yosef, and Pharaoh sends and calls Joseph. Vayiritzuhu min habor. The word vayiritzu means, and they rushed him from the pit. And again, imagine this, right? Pharaoh was sending his servants, right? His officers. And presumably, right, Pharaoh is itching to get the solution to his dreams. And then what do? They rush Joseph, right? You got to come immediately to Pharaoh. And then what's the next part? Vayigalach. He shaves himself. Vayichalef simlotav. He changes his garments. Vayavo el Paro. These few words, to me, express a very significant transformation in Joseph. This is Joseph's opportunity to get out of jail. This is his ticket to freedom. But Joseph has learned that when the opportunity presents itself, to do it in the best way possible. He's not just going to jump and immediately be dragged to Pharaoh's palace, but he wants to come to Pharaoh's palace in a very dignified way. He does not want to come as a slave, as someone who's disheveled, as someone who will fit that description which the butler gave of him. But he wants to come before Pharaoh as somebody who radiates majesty, self-respect. And now let's look, again, we're not going to get into the whole issue of the dreams and their solution. Let's look at a few verses which again show us something about Joseph and his leadership. Verse 17, after Pharaoh describes the situation, Joseph says to Pharaoh, Vayan Yosef et Paro lemor biladai, Elohim ya'aneh et shlom Paro. It's not like what he said to the butler and the baker. God has solutions. Tell me. Here he says, it's not about me. It's about God. God will be the one who will, and here even the word is, I think, very important. Ya'aneh et shlom Paro. He will answer the peace of Pharaoh, which I think also is very important. It's not just that God will give you a solution, God will actually give you a solution which you can be at peace with. And now let's look at what Joseph goes on to say. Pharaoh tells him all the dreams. And now, excuse me for 1 second. And now let's go to verse 25. After Pharaoh tells him the dreams, Vayomer Yosef el Paro, Chalom Paro echadhu. Although Pharaoh had 2 dreams, the 2 dreams are one. Et asher Elohim oseh higid leParo. Whatever God is about to do, he is telling Pharaoh, which means, contrary to what Joseph said to the butler and the baker, that God can solve dreams. Here Joseph is saying to Pharaoh, God is the source of the dream. God, in effect, is telling you now what is about to happen. And we all know the meaning of the dreams: 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty. And now I want to skip to verse 33. After Joseph essentially, in fact, maybe before we look at verse 33, so I'd like to look, at verse 32. After Joseph tells Pharaoh the solutions, he also says the following. Val hishanot hachalom el paro pa'amayim. And for the fact that the dream is repeated, ki nachon hadavar me'im ha'elohim u'memaher ha'elohim la'asoto. Because the matter is close at hand. God is going to be quick to make it happen. So Joseph also explains if in fact we're talking about really one solution, one dream, then why was it split up into 2 separate dreams? And his response is to say, because this is a way of highlighting the imminence of what's about to happen. And then in verse 33, V'ata yereh Pharaoh, and now may Pharaoh see, ish navon v'chacham, a man who is wise and smart, v'shiteu al eretz Mitzrayim, and point him over Egypt. And then Yaseh Paro v'yafkei pkidim, and then let Pharaoh set up all kinds of supervisors. And essentially what Joseph does is to present a whole, what we might call, plan, right? That's going to somehow avert the destruction. And he tells Pharaoh, find the right person. Here is the plan. And then when Pharaoh hears all of this is verse 37, and the matter was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and the eyes of his servants. And Pharaoh says in verse 38, is there anyone like this man who has the Spirit of God? And then in verse 39, after God has told you all this, there is none who is wise as you. You will be upon my house. Everything will happen according to your order. Only the chair, the throne, by virtue of the throne will I be greater than you. Verse 40. Now, Joseph's suggestion on a certain level is gratuitous. One might even say it looks pretty opportunistic, right? Now, find somebody. But what I would like to say is, yes, it is opportunistic, and yet it's done in a very respectable way. You might say Joseph is shrewd. You might say he's sophisticated. Yes, he is sophisticated. But I also want to say that the fact that Joseph presents this solution may also fit in with his whole understanding of the dream. And what do I mean by that? And that is that Joseph says to Pharaoh, these dreams that you have are really a way of God communicating with you what's about to happen. And on a certain level, that begs the question, why? Why would God want Pharaoh to know what's about to happen? And here I want to say this is really at the core of Joseph's understanding of dreams, which then also has a lot to say about his own personal dreams. And that is that God communicates to people in dreams, not just so that you know what's about to happen, but you now have with that knowledge, what are you about to do with it? What are you going to do about it? And in effect, when Joseph makes the suggestions that he does, what he's in effect saying to Pharaoh is, God is letting you know what can happen so that you can now prepare yourself and avert the disaster. And it's really in your hands. So go for it. And not only that, but you don't have a lot of time to waste. And if I take what Joseph says to Pharaoh, it may very well be that that is echoing how Joseph may very well have also understood his own dreams. That his own dreams were a communication by God as a way of God showing him, okay, that the role that he is going to play someday. Except that maybe right now, Joseph is able to then deal with that in a much more responsible way, which I'll discuss in a few moments. And interestingly, Pharaoh is responsive to Joseph. And there, I think, are two reasons for that. The first being that Joseph speaking all the time about God is something that Pharaoh can relate to, and to see this as somehow being a divine message which is being given to him. But beyond that, Pharaoh may very well see Joseph as someone who truly is a man of God, and a man of God in the sense of who has majesty. The way Joseph comes before Pharaoh is a corrective of the way Joseph interacted with the butler and the baker. Joseph has learned his lesson. Joseph has learned that yes, it is important to take advantage of opportunities. But what's equally, if not more important, is how. And to never lose sight of your dignity. And this is ultimately what enables Joseph to then take on that role. And just parenthetically, I want to say, when he is finally given this role, he's given new clothes. He's given a ring. So that clothing becomes a very important symbol in Joseph's life for the role that he plays. And once Joseph is given this clothing by Pharaoh, he will never shed that clothing. He will maintain that to the end of his life. So that the beginning of our Parsha is where Joseph has achieved his role of leadership. And so, if I would sum up what we have up to this point, the Joseph who was a lad, 17 years old, in chapter 37, the first time we see him, has now become a man at the age of 30. This is not what we call delayed adolescence. This is actually reaching manhood, big time. And he has gone through quite a few what you might call traumatic experiences along the way. But his greatness is to be able to learn from those experiences. And the major lesson that he's learned is that leadership, at least from his perspective, should not be about power, but it should be about service. And to be a real leader requires maturity. It requires carrying yourself in a way which is dignified, but not offensive, but not in your face. Being able to have a sense of majesty complemented with humility. And now I would just look forward to next week's Parsha at one verse, which gives us this final glimpse, excuse me, of Joseph's understanding of leadership. And that verse is in chapter, let's just find this, chapter 45, when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. Chapter 45, verse 5. Joseph says to the brothers, "Do not be sad, do not be angry that you sold me here, because for sustenance God sent me before you." And then once again he says this in verse 7. "And God sent me before you so that there would be a remnant, that you would be able to somehow continue living and to find a way to survive during the famine." And in verse 8, a third time, "And now it wasn't you who sent me, but it's God." And clearly in these three verses, the key word is shlichut, shalach, sent me, or what we would say, a mission. And I think that is the concluding point in Joseph's understanding of leadership. One needs to see their leadership as being a mission. And in Joseph's case, his mission is sent from God. God has given him a mission. Ultimately, his mission is to be able to somehow enable his family to survive during a time of famine. I might even add that at this point in next week's Parsha, Joseph is able to say to his brothers, it may very well be that the famine is part of a whole larger historical process of the Jewish people eventually coming down to Egypt, and the way to get them down to Egypt was by having a famine. And Joseph's role in that process was to be able to be the one who could somehow make sure that not only would they get down to Egypt, but be provided for in Egypt. So that Joseph somehow is able to see this larger picture. His dreams play a central role in this. Dreams for him is how God is somehow communicating to us that picture of what is about to be, but maybe of what we need to do to actualize those dreams. And so this is one model of leadership, Joseph. But there is a second model of leadership, which I'm going to begin today, and I'll hold you in suspense till next week, and that's Judah. And Judah is a very different model of leadership. And now I want to just show you, if you go back to last week's Parashat, chapter 38. And I'm sure many people here are familiar with the story of Judah and Tamar. But I just want to point out something which clearly disturbs classic commentaries. And I even heard a few people who asked me the same exact question. Good question. What is chapter 38 doing there? The logical thing would have been to go from chapter 37 to chapter 39. And what do I mean? The last point in chapter 37 is how Joseph was sold to Egypt. So then we would expect that the next chapter is going to pick up on that and describe what happened after Joseph was sold to Egypt. But instead of doing that, all of a sudden we go on a tangent, which is talking about Judah. And I think there's something which is very, very beautiful in the story of Joseph and his brothers. And that is, it's as if the Torah is giving you what we would call today a split screen. That on the one hand, it's telling you the story of Joseph and where he's going, right? The journey he's on. And yet at the same time, it's also looking at the journey which Judah and the other brothers are on. And at some point, the two journeys converge, which begins in our chapter, in our Parsha, but reaches its climax next week. But it's important to see how each one is looked at in its own terms. Chapter 38, which is describing Judah's journey, is very much parallel, but significantly different than chapter 39, with Joseph in the house of Potiphar. And I want to just look at the beginning, and I see my time is going to run out soon, and I want to at least make a few points about Judah. Chapter 38, verse 1. Vayhi ba'etahi, it was at that time, Vayered Yehuda me'et Echav, and Judah goes down from his brothers. Vayet ad ish Adulami ushmo Chira, and he goes to a man from Adulam whose name is Chira. And then Judah sees there the daughter of a Canaanite man whose name is Shua, and he takes her and comes upon her. Joseph was brought down to Egypt in chapter 39. Joseph was sold into slavery. It was not his choice. He did not want to go down. Joseph very much wanted to be with his father. In chapter 38, Judah goes down consciously. And not only that, it says he goes down from his brothers. Interestingly, there are certain commentaries who say, well, why do you use the language of going down? So they want to say, well, because, the Jews are living in the hill country, and where Judah is going is Adulam, which is more in the plain area. And so therefore, that's why you say he's going down. He's going from the mountains into the flatlands. But the fact that it says in Judah goes down from his brothers, it's not giving you the geography. Shows that what's happening here is not a geographical move. And as I've said, when I said with Jacob, when it says Vayetze Yaakov, it's an existential move. Judah is going down. There are midrashim which Rashi quotes, which say that the brothers demoted Judah. And what does that mean? Well, if you go back to chapter 37, after the brothers throw Joseph in the pit and they sit down to eat, in chapter 37, verse 26, and Judah said to the brothers, "What gain, what profit is there if we kill our brother and cover up his blood?" And verse 27, "Let us go and sell him to the Ishmaelites, so that our hand is not in him, because he is our brother, our flesh and blood." And the brothers listened to him. Now, this is the first time that we see Judah. And this is the first time that Judah is in a leadership role. Judah is ultimately the one who's responsible for the idea to sell Joseph into slavery. And what's perhaps important for us, Vayishma'u elav, Echav, the brothers listen to him, which means the brothers accept Judah's leadership. And what's his argument? We can't kill Joseph. For those brothers who thought to kill him, we can. Why? He's our brother. He's our flesh and blood. By the way, note when Reuven, in a few verses earlier, also said in verse 22, "Don't kill him, throw him into the pit." He never mentions anything about he's our brother. It's just, this is murder. How could you commit an act of murder? But Judah is very much conscious that this is our brother. But as you know, in the continuation of the story in chapter 37, the brothers end up fooling Jacob and send him Joseph's coat with blood on it, so that Jacob thinks that Joseph has been killed. And Jacob is inconsolable. And that's what leads to chapter 38, Judah going down. Some commentaries say Judah goes down because he's not able to deal with his father's grief. And he has to just get away. And maybe I would add right now, he's not able to come to terms with the terrible mistake he made and the implications of that mistake. And in effect, he's running away. Other commentaries say that Judah was deposed by the brothers. Not only that, but the brothers say to Judah, if you would have listened to you, it's your fault. So that the brothers are telling Judah, you made a tragic mistake. And in effect, it's the brothers who are, in a certain sense, pushing him away. And what I would like to, as I see my time is up now, leave you with, Judah is a natural leader. He's able to command the respect of his brothers. Why? I had hoped I would get to today, but we'll get to next week. But what Judah has to deal with is to be able to take responsibility for his actions. And initially, his response was, when he made a mistake, big time, to run away and essentially to put himself on a course where he is going down not only from his brothers, but where he is going down in terms of leaving, abandoning everything which his family believes in. He ends up marrying a Canaanite woman, has 3 sons, 2 of whom are killed by God because of their improper behavior. And then subsequently in the story of Tamar, when she masquerades as a prostitute, he goes to her consciously. And I hope you appreciate the contrast. 2 sexual encounters. Judah and Tamar, Joseph and Mrs. Potiphar. Mrs. Potiphar seduces Joseph day in, day out. And Joseph is able to resist that. Joseph ultimately runs away. And Judah is looking for that. And not only looking, but in the end, has sexual relations with a woman who he assumes is a prostitute. And that, in a certain sense, is when he bottoms out. But that isn't even when he bottoms out. He bottoms out when he discovers that his daughter-in-law, who he had impregnated, but he doesn't know that, became pregnant, and then says she should be taken out to be burned. This is verse 24. And as she's being taken out in verse 25, she sends to her father-in-law and says, I want you to know the one who impregnated me is the one who owns this signet ring and this staff. She could have easily implicated Judah, but she didn't. And this is his moment of truth. Is he prepared to now acknowledge what he did, even though this will be very embarrassing to him as someone who is a very respectable person in the framework that he operates in? Or will he try to somehow cover it up, run away, even to the point where he will execute someone who he knows is innocent? And in verse 26, Judah recognizes the signet ring and says, Tzadka mimeni, she is more righteous than me, insofar as I did not give her my son. This becomes a turning point for Judah. Judah now learns to be a leader means to take responsibility, to be willing to acknowledge your mistakes, to not make somebody else a scapegoat for your mistakes, and to be able to say publicly, I was wrong, even if that causes you embarrassment. And it's that statement, Tzadka mimeni, which paves the way not only for Judah to then go back to his family, but eventually to take on a major leadership role in his family. Next week, what I'd like to do is to examine this much further. This idea of a leader being responsible, taking responsibilities for decisions that they make. And I think after we do that, to then put Joseph and Judah in dialogue with each other, which is the beginning of next week's Parashat, and see what happens and why. So stay tuned for next week. And again, I would like to express my profound gratitude and thanks, not only to Pardes institutionally, but to all the people who have been involved in this campaign, which I see as being not a way of just honoring me, but even more as a way of being a tribute to my wife Malka and to the relationship which we shared for many years, which I think in the end made its impact on Pardes. Chanukah Sameach and Shabbat Shalom to everyone.